Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to say, looking at the stack of documents and research we have on the desk today, it feels like we're about to open a cold case file that's been sitting dusty in the archives of American history for way, way too long.
It really does feel like a cold case. Or, maybe a missing persons case, considering how this story ends up.
Exactly. We are tackling a figure today who is, quite frankly, a walking contradiction. He's a man who you could argue is the single most important founding father in terms of, actually getting the revolution off the ground. He's the guy who provided the spark.
Right. Without him, that whole powder keg might never have exploded, or at least not in the way that it did.
Right. But here is the kicker, and this is the statistic that just blew my mind when I started reading the prep material. This man was the best-selling author of the entire 18th century. He was, for a time, probably the most famous American in the world. And yet, when he died, do you know how many people showed up to his funeral?
It's a heartbreaking number. It's 6.
6 people. And we're not talking about some private, family-only ceremony. We're talking about a man who was essentially ostracized by the very nation he helped create.
The contrast is just so stark. We are, of course, talking about Thomas Paine, the man who historians think likely coined the name United States of America, the man whose words were read to the troops at Valley Forge to stop them from deserting, and yet by the end of his life, he was a pariah.
So our mission today is to unpack this radical life. And radical is absolutely the right word. His life reads less like a history textbook and more like a tragedy mixed with some kind of wild adventure novel.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at the outline, we have failed corset making. We have escapes from execution by a chalk mark. We have privateers. We have a feud with George Washington, and we have this very, very bizarre, almost gothic horror story about his stolen bones.
The saga of the bones is the perfect, weird ending to a life that just refused to fit into any neat box. But you're right. To understand Paine is to understand the power of words and the price of sticking to your principles when the world changes around you.
So let's dive in, and we have to start at the beginning. And the beginning is surprisingly, well, ordinary. Actually, ordinary might be a bit generous. It was kind of a disaster.
It was a real struggle. Thomas Paine was born in Thetford, England in 1737. And if you have a picture in your head of a founding father, the marble statue, the wealthy Virginia planter, the Harvard-educated lawyer, you just have to delete that image completely. Paine was none of those things.
He was working class.
Deeply working class. His father, Joseph Paine, and it's worth noting the spelling in the early records is P-A-I-N without the E, was a tenant farmer and a staymaker.
Okay, we need to pause on staymaker, because I saw this in the notes and I had to look up what that actually meant. It's not just making clothes, is it?
No, it's industrial labor. Stays are the stiffening structures that go inside women's corsets. In the 18th century, that meant working with whalebone. You'd have to heat it, bend it, stitch it into this heavy canvas. It was physically demanding, smelly, really repetitive work. It was a trade, but not a glamorous one at all.
And his mother, Frances, was Anglican, but his father was a Quaker. That religious mix seems really important, given Paine's later reputation.
It's crucial. Quakers in that era were, very distinct. They believed in the inner light, this idea that God communicates directly to every individual, not through a priest or a bishop or some church hierarchy.
So anti-authority from the start.
Very anti-hierarchy. They were often pacifists, and they believed in a kind of spiritual equality that was incredibly radical for the class-stratified society of England. You can see that DNA all over Paine's writing. He had this natural, deep-seated aversion to people claiming they were better than others just because of who their father was.
But he wasn't spending his youth debating theology. He was pulled out of school pretty young, wasn't he?
Very young. He attended Thetford Grammar School, but his formal education ended when he was 13.
13, that's it.
That's it. At 13 years old, he was apprenticed to his father. He was in the shop bending whalebone. I mean, can you imagine? He was looking at a future of just grinding manual labor, and he clearly hated every minute of it.
He must have, because at age 19, the notes say he did something completely out of left field. He ran away to sea.
He did. He enlisted on a ship called the King of Prussia.
And this wasn't the Royal Navy. This was a privateer.
Yes. And we should probably explain what that means, because privateer sounds sort of dashing and romantic.
It sounds like a gentleman pirate, right?
Right, but
Yeah.
It was essentially a state-sanctioned pirate. Britain was on the brink of the 7 Years' War, so the government would issue what they called letters of marque to private ship owners. These letters gave them legal permission to attack enemy merchant ships, mostly French ships, and steal their cargo.
So he was signing up for legalized armed robbery on the high seas.
That's a great way to put it. It was incredibly dangerous work. I mean, disease, storms, combat. For a boy raised in a pacifist Quaker household, this was just a massive rebellion. It really shows you he had this wild streak, or at least a desperate need to escape the crushing boredom of Thetford.
But he didn't stick with the pirate life for long. He came back to Britain in 1759.
He did. He tried to settle down. He became a master staymaker himself, and he set up a shop in Sandwich in Kent. He was, trying to do the respectable thing.
And this is where the tragedy really starts to creep in.
Yeah.
Because looking at this timeline, he just cannot catch a break.
No, he really can't. He married a woman named Mary Lambert in 1759, but his business collapsed almost immediately. The economy was bad. They had to move to Margate to try to find work. Mary went into early labor, and in the 18th century, without modern medicine, well, both she and the child died.
That is just devastating. He's in his early 20s, his business has failed, he's completely broke, and he's just lost his wife and his child.
It's the kind of trauma that either breaks you or it radicalizes you. For Paine, it really seems to have left him adrift. He was just looking for a purpose. He eventually left the corset trade for good and got a job as an excise officer.
The tax man.
The most hated man in England.
Which is deeply, deeply ironic, considering he becomes the voice of the American Revolution against British taxes.
The irony is profound, but you have to understand the job. He was stationed in places like Grantham and Alford. His job was to patrol for smugglers and collect duties on goods like brandy, tea, and tobacco. But he wasn't very good at playing the bureaucratic game.
I saw in the notes he was fired. What happened there?
He was dismissed in 1765 for claiming to have inspected goods he did not inspect.
So he was just rubber stamping the paperwork.
Exactly. He was stamping the goods without actually doing the physical inspection. Maybe he was lazy, maybe he thought the rules were stupid, or maybe he was just trying to be efficient, but whatever the reason, he got caught.
He begged for his job back, though, right?
He did. He wrote a petition to the Board of Excise and was eventually reinstated. But it really shows a pattern. He did not respect authority just because it was authority. He drifted around a bit. He even taught school in London for a while, and then he got posted to Lewes in Sussex.
And it seems like Lewes is where he starts to become Thomas Paine, the political thinker.
Lewes was a unique town. It had this strong tradition of debate and even anti-monarchist sentiment. Paine got involved in local civic matters. He served on the town's governing body. But most importantly, he started organizing his fellow workers.
This is the case of the Officers of Excise, his first real political writing.
Published in 1772. And it wasn't a call for revolution, not at all. It was a labor dispute. He was arguing that excise officers like him were severely underpaid. He wrote this really detailed pamphlet explaining that if you pay tax collectors starvation wages, you're practically forcing them to take bribes from smugglers just to survive.
That's actually a very sophisticated argument for a guy with just a grammar school education.
Well,
he's talking about systemic incentives.
It is. He printed 4,000 copies. He spent a whole winter in London, standing outside Parliament, handing them out to MPs. He was lobbying. He was trying to work within the system to fix a real grievance.
And how did the system respond?
The system crushed him. Parliament ignored him completely. And because he had spent all that time in London lobbying instead of doing his job, he was fired from the excise service again in April 1774.
So let's just take stock here for a minute. He's 37 years old. He's been fired twice. He failed as a corset maker. He tried to run a tobacco shop in Lewes, and that failed too. He's separated from his second wife, Elizabeth Olive, and he has to sell all of his household possessions just to avoid debtor's prison.
By every single standard of his society, Thomas Paine was a total failure. He was destitute. He was a nobody. If he had died in 1774, he would have been buried in a pauper's grave, and we would never, ever have heard his name.
But he makes one connection, one handshake that changes everything.
In London, through his interest in science, he'd met a mathematician named George Lewis Scott. And Scott introduced him to a man who was in London representing the American colonies.
Benjamin Franklin.
The doctor himself. Franklin was the most famous American in the world at that point, a total celebrity. And he meets this scruffy, angry, but incredibly articulate Englishman. And for some reason, Franklin saw potential in him.
Franklin was the ultimate talent scout.
He really was. He saw a spark in Paine. Maybe he liked his bluntness, his lack of deference. Franklin wrote a letter of recommendation for Paine. He suggested he move to Philadelphia. He wrote to his son-in-law in America, The bearer, Mr. Thomas Paine, is very well recommended to me as an ingenious, worthy young man.
That letter was basically a golden ticket.
It was a lifeline. Paine got on a ship in October 1774. But even the journey was a complete disaster. The ship's water was contaminated. Typhoid fever broke out. 5 passengers died on the crossing. When they docked in Philadelphia that November, Paine was so sick he couldn't walk. He had to be carried off on a stretcher.
It's just amazing to think how fragile history is. If that fever had been just a little bit worse, there's no common sense.
It hangs by a thread. But he survived. He was nursed back to health, partly thanks to Franklin's connections. And once he was on his feet, he looked around at America, and he found a place where a guy like him could finally fit in.
He becomes an editor pretty quickly.
Yes. In early 1775, he became the editor of the Pennsylvania magazine, and he turned out to be brilliant at it. He grew the readership massively. He wrote about everything: science, marriage, politics, you name it.
And he didn't waste any time getting radical. I saw a note about an essay called African Slavery in America.
Yes. Published in March 1775, it wasn't signed, but Benjamin Rush, another key founding father, attributed it to Paine.
Yeah.
It called slavery an execrable commerce.
Execrable. That's a strong word. It means detestable.
He called it an outrage against humanity and justice. And this is so important because while many founders were, slave owners who talked a good game about liberty, Paine was a dedicated abolitionist from the very start. He believed rights were universal. If they applied to him, they applied to everyone.
So he is establishing himself as a powerful voice. But then comes January 1776, the moment everything changes. Common sense.
The pamphlet that sparked the fire.
Now, we all learn about common sense in school, but I feel like we gloss over just how radical it was for its time. Can you set the scene for us? What was the mood in the colonies in early 1776?
This is the crucial context. The war had actually already started. The battles of Lexington and Concord happened in April 1775. The Battle of Bunker Hill happened in June, so people were already shooting at each other. But, and this is a huge but, most colonists were not fighting for independence.
What were they fighting for then?
They were fighting for their rights as Englishmen. They wanted a return to the status quo. They blamed Parliament and the king's ministers for the bad taxes, but they still toasted King George III at dinner. The prevailing hope was that the king would step in and fix things. They saw themselves as loyal subjects who were just being mistreated by some corrupt bureaucrats.
So the idea of breaking away completely was...
Well, it was fringe idea.
It was terrifying. It was treason. And practically speaking, it seemed impossible. Britain was the greatest superpower on earth.
And then Paine publishes Common Sense.
And he just shatters that entire illusion. He attacks the king directly. He calls George III the royal brute of Britain.
I love that insult, the royal brute. It's so direct.
It's brilliant branding, isn't it? It just strips away all the majesty. He argued that the whole idea of hereditary monarchy was absurd. He famously said that having a hereditary ruler is as ridiculous as having a hereditary mathematician. Just because your dad was smart doesn't mean you are.
And he used the Bible to do it, which was genius. He knew his audience. Americans at the time were a deeply religious people. So he used the Old Testament to show that when the ancient Israelites asked for a king, it was considered a sin against God. He turned the king from a benevolent father figure into a usurper, an enemy of God's will.
But it wasn't just the argument, was it? It was the style. Our mission for this deep dive mentioned his plain writing style.
That was the revolution within the revolution. Before Paine, political pamphlets were written by lawyers for lawyers. They were dense, they were full of Latin phrases, full of complex legal precedents. You basically needed a degree to understand them. Paine wrote for the guy in the tavern, he wrote for the farmer in the field. He used short sentences, he used metaphors people actually understood.
He democratized the debate.
He did. He took politics out of the elite drawing room and put it right in the street. And the sales were just insane.
Give us the numbers.
He estimated it sold around 100,000 copies in the first 3 months. Some biographers think it eventually reached 500,000 copies by the end of the war.
And the population of the colonies was only about 2.5 million people at the time.
Exactly. Proportionally, that would be like a book selling tens of millions of copies today. It was everywhere. If you couldn't read, someone read it to you out loud. It completely crystallized public opinion. It shifted the entire conversation from redress of grievances to independence.
It's interesting, though, that not all the founders loved it. John Adams really had a problem with Paine.
Oh, Adams. Adams hated Paine's populism. Adams wanted independence, absolutely. But Adams was a conservative at heart. He believed in order, hierarchy, checks and balances. Paine was arguing for a radical democracy, universal manhood suffrage, no property requirements to vote. To a guy like Adams, that sounded like mob rule.
What did he call it? A crapulous mass.
Remember crapulous mass? Adams famously said, "Without the pen of the author of Common Sense, the sword of Washington would have been raised in vain." So he admitted Paine was necessary, but he really did not like him. He thought he was too dangerous, too democratic.
But Washington saw its value.
Washington found it incredibly useful. It gave his soldiers a reason to fight. Suddenly, it wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about building a whole new world.
Speaking of building a new world, let's talk about the name, the United States of America.
This is a detail I absolutely love. Before Paine, people would say the United Colonies or just America. But in June of 1776, Paine wrote a letter in the Pennsylvania Evening Post under the pseudonym Republicus.
He did love a pseudonym.
He did. Common Sense was just signed by an Englishman. In this Republicus letter, he argued that to get foreign aid from France and Spain, they needed to be a real nation, not just a bunch of rebellious colonies. And he wrote, "I shall rejoice to hear the title of the United States of America."
He wrote it in all caps.
He emphasized it. He was branding the new nation. He understood that words create reality. If you start calling yourself a United States, you start acting like one.
That brings us to late 1776. The branding is great. The Declaration of Independence is signed, but the war itself is going terribly.
It's a complete disaster. Washington has been kicked out of New York. He's retreating across New Jersey. The army is shrinking by the day. Disease is rampant. Morale is at zero. It really looks like the revolution is going to be crushed before the first winter is even over.
And Paine is there, on the ground.
He's traveling with the army. He's serving as an aide-de-camp to General Nathaniel Greene. He sees the retreat firsthand. He sees the footprints in the snow stained with blood from soldiers who don't have proper boots.
And he starts writing again.
He writes The American Crisis. The story is he wrote it on a drumhead by the light of a campfire. And the opening line is just iconic. "These are the times that try men's souls."
The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country.
It's a challenge. He's calling them out. He's saying it's easy to be a patriot when it's sunny and things are going well, but who are you when it's dark? Washington was so moved by it that he ordered it to be read to all the troops before they crossed the Delaware to attack Trenton.
And that was the turning point of the war.
It really was, and Paine's words were the soundtrack to that victory.
So we have Paine as the voice of the revolution. But then, as seems to be the pattern with him, things get messy. We move into part 3, diplomat and troublemaker.
Paine was never, ever good at playing politics. He was a truth teller, and that is a very dangerous thing to be in any government.
This is the Silas Deane affair. This seems complicated, but can you boil it down for us?
Okay, the simple version is this. Silas Deane was an American diplomat in France. His job was to get supplies for the war. Paine, who was the secretary to the Committee on Foreign Affairs, which was a big job, he discovered that Deane was charging Congress for supplies that the French king had actually intended as secret gifts.
So Deane was basically pocketing the money. War profiteering.
That's what Paine concluded. And Paine, being Paine, couldn't just stay quiet. He saw this as corruption, as a betrayal of the revolution. So he published all the details in the newspaper.
There was a catch. A big one.
A huge catch. In the process of proving that Deane was a crook, Paine cited secret documents that revealed France was sending aid before they had officially signed a treaty of alliance. France was still technically neutral. Paine just outed their entire secret operation to the world.
Whoops.
Yeah, big whoops. The French minister was furious. Congress was deeply embarrassed. They had to fire Paine to save face and preserve the alliance. He went from being a high-ranking government official to being completely disgraced. He was even physically assaulted in the street by some of Deane's merchant friends.
He just couldn't help himself, could he? He valued the truth more than the diplomatic game.
And the really tragic part is, later evidence showed that Paine was right all along. Deane was corrupt, but Paine was the one who paid the price. He ended up broke again and out of a job.
But he keeps going. He goes back to France in 1781 with John Lawrence to help get more money. He helps set up the Bank of North America. He always trying to be useful to the cause.
And eventually, he does get some recognition. When the war finally ends, the state of New York gives him a farm in New Rochelle. Congress gives him $3,000. He finally has a home and some security.
He could have retired right then. He could have just been a gentleman farmer.
He absolutely could have. But his brain just would not turn off. And this brings us to what the outline calls the scientific interlude.
I love this part. He decides he's going to build bridges.
Literally. He became obsessed with the idea of single-span iron bridges. At the time, bridges were either wood or stone. Stone was incredibly expensive. Wood rotted and needed constant repair. Paine designed this innovative single-span iron bridge that could cross the Schuylkill River in Philadelphia.
That was incredibly high-tech for the 1780s.
It was cutting-edge engineering. He couldn't get the funding for it in America, so in 1787, he sailed back to Europe, first to France and then to England, to find investors for his bridge project. He was showing off his models to the Royal Society. He was hanging out with scientists. He also invented a smokeless candle and worked on early steam engines. He was a true Enlightenment man.
But while he is in Europe trying to sell his bridge idea, history intervenes again. The French Revolution.
1789, the Bastille falls. And Paine, who was right there, is pulled back into the political vortex.
And this leads to his next great work, Rights of Man.
This was a direct response to Edmund Burke. Burke, who was a famous British politician, wrote a book called Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was a scathing attack on what was happening, calling it chaos and anarchy. Paine read it and was absolutely furious. He wrote Rights of Man in 1791 as a direct rebuttal and a defense of the revolution.
And if common sense was radical, Rights of Man was. I mean, it was on another level entirely.
It went so much further. In Common Sense, he attacked a specific king. In Rights of Man, he attacked the entire concept of the past having any right to rule the present. He wrote, and this is a key line, "Every age and generation must be as free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it."
He's basically saying tradition doesn't matter.
He's saying the dead have no rights, only the living have rights. He advocated for a republic, a written constitution, social welfare programs. The book sold nearly 1 million copies.
And the British government was not happy about that.
They were terrified. They were convinced a revolution was going to start in London. They indicted him for seditious libel. They hired spies to follow him everywhere he went. Mobs were organized to burn him in effigy in towns all across England.
This is where the poet William Blake comes into the story.
Yes, the famous poet and artist. The story goes that Blake met Paine at a dinner party and warned him, "Do not go home tonight. They are coming to arrest you." Paine took the advice, and in September 1792, he got on a boat and fled to France.
He escaped by the skin of his teeth.
By mere hours. He was tried in absentia in England and convicted of treason. He was now an outlaw in his own birth country. He could never go back.
But in France, he's a hero.
A total superstar. He was made an honorary citizen, and despite not speaking a word of French, he was elected to the National Convention.
That is just wild. He is a member of parliament in a country where you can't speak the language.
He had to have his speeches translated and read aloud by other delegates, but his presence was hugely symbolic. He was the author of Common Sense, the man who helped create the American Republic.
But the French Revolution wasn't the American Revolution. It got dark very, very quickly.
It got very dark. The Jacobins, the radicals led by Maximilien Robespierre, started to take over. They wanted blood. They put the king, Louis XVI, on trial for his life.
And this is the moment where Paine proves his integrity again, doesn't he? The man who hates kings with a passion votes to save the king's life.
It stunned everyone. Paine argued that execution was immoral. He was fundamentally against the death penalty. And he made a practical point as well. Louis XVI had helped the American Revolution. He was an ally. Paine stood up and said, "Let's not kill him. Let's exile him to America."
He wanted to send the King of France to live in Philadelphia.
He thought he could live there as a private citizen, maybe learn how to be a Democrat.
That is wildly optimistic, to say the least.
It absolutely infuriated the Jacobins. Jean-Paul Marat interrupted the reading of Paine's speech, shouting that the translator was lying because he couldn't believe Paine would say such a thing. But Paine stood his ground.
And that single vote put a massive target on his back.
It did. The king was executed. The reign of terror began. The Jacobins started rounding up and executing all of their political enemies. Paine was a foreigner, and he was allied with the moderate faction, the Girondins. In December of 1793, he was arrested.
This brings us to part 5. The chalk mark. This has to be the lowest point of his entire life.
He was thrown into Luxembourg prison. It was basically a waiting room for the guillotine. People were being taken out in batches every single day and beheaded. Paine was 56, he was sick with a fever, and he was watching his friends die, one by one.
And while he's in there, what is the United States doing, the country he helped create?
Nothing. This is the great betrayal. The U.S. ambassador at the time was a man named Gouverneur Morris. Morris was a Federalist who hated Paine's radical ideas. He thought Paine was a dangerous anarchist. And Morris essentially just let him rot in that prison. He made no effort to claim him as an American citizen.
And Washington.
Washington stayed silent. Washington was president. He was trying to keep the U.S. neutral in the wars between Britain and France. He didn't want to anger either side, so he sacrificed Paine for diplomatic convenience. Paine sat in that cell for months, waiting for a letter from his old friend George Washington that never came.
That must have just broken his heart.
It broke his heart, and it filled him with a rage that would fester for years. But first, he had to survive. And this brings us to the famous chalk-mark story.
Tell us this. It feels like something straight out of a movie script.
So, at the height of the terror, the jailers would come around at night with a list of who was scheduled to be executed the next morning. They would mark the cell door of the condemned with chalk, usually a cross or a number.
He was a mark of death.
Right. Paine was in a cell with a few other men, and he was very sick with a fever. His cell door had been left open to let some air in. Now, the door was heavy, and it opened outwards into the corridor, pressing flat against the outer wall.
Okay, I'm visualizing this.
The jailer came by, checked his list, and he chalked Paine's door. But because the door was open, he put the mark on the side of the door that was facing the corridor, which was actually the inside face of the door when it was closed.
So when they shut the door for the night?
The mark was on the inside of the cell, hidden from view.
So the next morning, the execution squad comes down the hall.
They walk down the hall, they look at all the closed doors, they don't see a mark on Paine's door, they walk right past him and take the men from the other cells.
He slept through his own execution because of a simple geometry error.
It was a miracle. Pure chance. And a few days later, Robespierre fell from power. The terror ended. Paine survived.
Eventually, James Monroe, the future president, became a new ambassador and got him released. But Paine was a changed man.
He was deeply bitter. And he was also angry at organized religion, which he felt had enabled so much tyranny. And while he was in prison, he wrote his most controversial book, The Age of Reason.
This is part 6, Controversial Ideas. And this is the book that really destroyed his reputation in America. Why?
Because it was a frontal assault on the Bible. Paine was a deist. He believed in God. He would look at the stars in the universe and see evidence of a creator. But he rejected organized religion. He rejected miracles, prophecies, and the divinity of Jesus.
He called the Bible the word of a demon.
He did. He went through it and pointed out all the violence, the contradictions, the obscene stories in the Old Testament. And in the 1790s, America was going through a major religious revival, the Second Great Awakening. So this book was just shocking. He was immediately branded an atheist, which he wasn't, but the label stuck. People who had loved common sense were now publicly burning The Age of Reason.
He just could not read the room, could he?
He didn't care about the room. He only cared about what he thought was the truth.
And then on top of that, he wrote Agrarian Justice in 1797. This is his big economic proposal.
This is my favorite of his later works. It is so unbelievably ahead of its time. Paine argued that poverty was not a natural state. He said it was created by civilization and specifically by the concept of private property.
He said the earth belongs to everyone in common.
Exactly. He said that when an individual owns a piece of land, they are excluding everyone else from their natural inheritance. So they owe a kind of ground rent back to society for that privilege.
And what did he want to do with that money?
He proposed creating a national fund, and he wanted to use that fund to give every single person, man or woman, rich or poor, a lump sum of 15 pounds sterling when they turn 21, a capital grant to get started in life.
A nest egg for everyone.
And on top of that, he wanted to give every person over the age of 50 an annual pension of 10 pounds for the rest of their life.
He basically invented Social Security.
And universal basic income in 1797. But of course, the wealthy elite thought this was absolute madness. They called it leveling. They called it theft. It was just too radical.
So he has alienated the church. He has alienated the wealthy. And then he decides to go after the most popular man in America.
The letter to George Washington. In 1796, still furious about being abandoned in that French prison, he finally let all of his anger out. He published a scathing open letter accusing Washington of being incompetent as a general and treacherous as a friend.
We called him a hypocrite, an imposter.
He wrote, "The world will be puzzled to decide whether you are an apostate or an imposter."
You just do not talk about George Washington that way in 1790s America.
Not if you want to have any friends left. That letter was the final nail in the coffin. When Paine finally returned to the United States in 1802, invited by President Jefferson, He was a pariah.
How bad was the reception?
It was brutal. The Federalist newspapers attacked him mercilessly. They called him a loathsome reptile and a drunken infidel. Old friends shunned him. People wouldn't shake his hand on the street. He was old, he was in poor health, and he was drinking far too much.
And the final insult came in New Rochelle on his own farm.
In 1806, he went to vote in a local election, and the officials at the polling place turned him away. They said he wasn't a citizen.
The man who named the country.
They argued that because he had accepted honorary French citizenship, he had forfeited his American status. And Gouverneur Morris, his old enemy from Paris, was there and just let it happen. It was a complete and utter humiliation.
And he dies in 1809.
In Greenwich Village, New York City, on June 8th.
The obituary was just cold.
He had lived long, did some good and much harm. That was it.
And the funeral. This brings us right back to where we started.
He had wished to be buried in the Quaker cemetery, but because of his writings against the Bible, they refused him. So he was buried in a corner of his farm in New Rochelle. And 6 people came. 2 were black freedmen, paying their respects to his abolitionist views, a French woman named Marguerite de Bonneville who had cared for him, and her children. That was it.
No state funeral, no cannons, no eulogies from famous men.
It's a silence.
But the story doesn't end there, does it? We have to talk about the bones.
The bones. So in 1819, a British radical journalist named William Cobbett, who used to hate Paine but then became a huge admirer, decided that Paine was being neglected and that his proper resting place should be England.
So he just dug him up.
He went to the farm in New Rochelle in the middle of the night, dug up the coffin, and took Paine's bones. He packed them in a box and sailed back to Liverpool.
What on earth was the plan?
He wanted to build a massive memorial, a shrine to Paine. He thought the British working class would flock to it and be inspired to revolution. But it completely backfired. People just thought it was ghoulish and creepy. The town crier in Thetford, Paine's birthplace, refused to even announce the arrival of the bones.
So Cobbett is now stuck with a skeleton in his attic.
Literally. He kept the bones in a trunk until he died in 1835. And then his estate was auctioned off. And in the chaos, the bones were separated.
Separated? You mean lost?
They were lost. They just vanished. Over the years, people have popped up claiming to have his skull or a hand or his jawbone. There are bizarre rumors that they were made into buttons. But the truth is, nobody knows. There is no grave. Thomas Paine is scattered to the winds.
My country is the world.
It's weirdly fitting for him, isn't it? He couldn't be contained by one plot of land, even in death.
So what is the legacy then? Because despite the lost bones, his ideas, so many of them, they won in the end.
They absolutely did. Abraham Lincoln was a huge fan. His direct, plain writing style was heavily influenced by Paine. Thomas Edison called him one of the greatest Americans. His ideas on social security, on secular government, on universal human rights, they are the bedrock of modern democracy, even if we don't always credit him for them.
He was the guy who could tear down the old house, even if he didn't quite know how to live in the new one he'd designed.
He was a perpetual revolutionary. He was uncomfortable in peacetime. He needed a crisis to fight, a tyrant to overthrow.
So here's a final thought for you, for the listener. Paine wrote that his generation would be the atom of a new world. He really thought they were building a kind of utopia. If you walked into America today, what would he think?
He'd love the technology. He would adore the internet. It's the ultimate common sense distribution method. But I think he'd look at the massive income inequality, the worship of political figures, the fact that we still haven't solved poverty, and he'd grab a pen.
He'd start writing Common Sense Part 2.
And he'd probably get himself canceled for it within a week.
He absolutely would. But maybe we need a little bit of that energy now and then.
We always do.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the incredible radical life of Thomas Paine. It has been a wild ride from start to finish.
Keep asking questions.
We'll see you next time.